Hey everybody, welcome to Animal Activism Collective's YouTube channel. Today we're discussing the recent ALF raid of a fox farm in Illinois. Before we get started, I'm going to read a quick disclaimer. While Animal Activism Collective supports the overall mission of animal liberation, our group was not involved in recent ALF actions. We are simply reporting on it and discussing it here. And I'm joined by two incredible guests, longtime activists and North American Animal Liberation Press Officer, Dr. Jerry Vlasak, as well as former fugitive, former animal liberator, former political prisoner, and author, Peter Young. Welcome to the live stream, guys.
Hi, Trey.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah, first, Dr. Vlasak, if you could, let's talk about this fur farm. It was rated back, I believe, in 2005 by the ALF. If you could just take us from that raid to now.
Yeah, so this is a fox farm known to exist in Illinois. It's one of the very few fur farms in the country that's still farming foxes and killing them for their fur. There were uh, the previous raid was accompanied by a press release at the time. And this was the second attempt to close this fur farm, which has remained open. From the communique in 2005, it talks about descending on the farm. He's one of the top breeders of silver foxes in the United States, and the breeding animals were specifically targeted, and most of the fence was removed, and dozens of foxes were released at that time. The most recent communique, which was received only a few days ago, apparently happened on the night of the 26th of August, and talks about opening the cages of approximately 25. And there's known to be about 100 foxes on this farm, which actually makes it one of the larger fox farms in the country. And 25 cages were opened, and the fence around the farm was cut, allowing some or all of these foxes to escape.
Yeah, I'd like to take a moment for those who are not familiar with the action or haven't read the communique yet. I'm just going to quickly read through the communique, and then Peter, I'd like to get your thoughts. This is the communique from the animal liberators that was submitted anonymously. It says Kerry Litig had previously been visited by the ALF in 2005. Apparently, he did not get the message about what happens to those who stay in this barbaric business. So last night, we decided to remind him. We saw by his motion lights, cameras, and electric fence that he had at least learned to be paranoid, but not paranoid enough. With a little recon, we were able to circumvent these defenses and make our way to the cages. It is sickening to see such majestic wild animals reduced to a short life in a tiny cage, awaiting a certain and brutal death just to satisfy human greed. We would make sure that greed would have a price. We ripped open the first cage, then the second, and soon we could not stop, even as the brightening sky threatened to reveal us. Many of the foxes were too scared to leave their cages, but periodically we would look back and notice one after the other had made their way to the ground and were searching for their way out. With the darkness all but gone, we reluctantly made our way to the damaged fence, but not before pocketing a couple dozen of the cards on the cages holding valuable genetic information. We are far from satisfied with this action. We had to leave many animals behind, but we will be back. We are sure that Kerry Littig will have even more security measures in place next time. That is, if he can afford them. He might spare himself some time and money if he read up on the history of the Animal Liberation Front and realized that security systems do not intimidate us. We will find a way in. We always do. To all the vegans reading this, it's your turn now. Pelting season is just 3 months away. How many foxes and mink will die in November and how many will live out their natural lives is all up to you. No excuses. You know what to do. ALF. Peter, I'd love your thoughts on this communique.
I like this communique because I think It does what I think a good communique should do, which is you always want to be speaking to, well, there's two potential audiences for a communique. There's really, I guess, three actually. One would be the media, one would be the farmers themselves, and then one would be activists. And I think it's important to write a communique with the media in mind, but I think Jerry does a fantastic job of what he does, and I think it's not necessarily as important as addressing activists directly. I remember a time, I don't know, it's interesting now because in 2025, we all get bombarded with so much media, vastly more than we did maybe back in the 90s. But I remember reading communiques and every activist would study them like they were, you know, they were like scrolls handed down from the top of a mountain or something. Everyone would just like study the communiques and read them word for word, and they carried a lot of weight. And I hope that's still the case, but I do know that the communiques would have a tremendous impact on activists, and I know they had a tremendous impact on me and other people in terms of as short as they are, they can really kind of steer the direction of activists that are also going to go take action and they're inspired by these communiques. So I like the communique because it's very simple. Hey, you know what to do. It sort of leaves it in the hands of all the rest of us to pick up where they left off. And I do like the element of the line about we always find a way in because it's just demoralizing to farmers, and that's always a good thing. So, and it's true. So, yeah, I thought it was a great communication. And I also appreciate they left out a lot of the, I think everyone should have complete. I mean, if you're carrying out an action, the world defers to you. You have complete control over what you say, how you represent yourself, and everything else. And no one should really have an opinion about it because where was I the night they were raiding foxes? Where were we? What were we doing the night they were? So I don't believe in like editorializing too much about communiques, but I do think it's my personal opinion. I do like when a lot of the sort of bigger political stuff is left out and it's just kept focused on the animals because I do think it just alienates people that maybe if you talk about being an anarchist, well, maybe you're not an anarchist. So it's not really going to resonate with everybody or whatever. So I think it was a great communique.
Yeah, the part about that you mentioned specifically about, always finding a way in no matter what, it sort of reminded me about the part in your book, Liberate, where you discuss what you call the cop inside your head, which is, correct me if I'm wrong or please expand, but basically that voice in your head that says you can't do it, you won't find a way into this farm, they'll have too much security, you'll get caught. Um, but these people, even though this farm had been raided before, and even though they had the security measures in place, these activists were successfully able to get into the farm, release 25 animals that would have otherwise been slaughtered and skinned. And now these animals hopefully are alive and living out their lives in nature. So yeah, would you like to talk about that a little bit? Just the cop inside your head and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, along the
Yeah,
before
that's the
before
idea that,
Peter before Peter goes on, let me just tell you there was an essay out not a few years ago called how they got in, I think it was, and I don't know, I think that may have come through Peter's office at one point or another, but it was a nice essay on all the different ways that the ALF finds to get into places where they technically shouldn't be. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Peter.
Yeah, I think I actually wrote that. That was something in my book, but yeah, I think I submitted that to Bitebacks a while ago and it didn't make it in, so I just stuck in the book. But yeah, so if you just look at the ALF and all the different ways they've gotten in, there's been some incredibly creative tactics, and I think a lot of times the best tactics are they can't even be discussed because we don't want to be alerting the targets as to how there's been quite a few actions where after the action they just say, hey, this looks like an inside job, like we have no idea how they got in. And so I think a lot of times the best tactics maybe are ones that can't even be discussed publicly. But back to the cop in your head. Yeah, I mean that idea is basically just we police ourselves more than the actual police do in terms of how we tell ourselves what's possible, what's not possible. We can't do this. This will be unpopular, et cetera, et cetera. All the different things we do, ways we kind of rein in our behavior and constrain ourselves from actually acting in a way that we know that we should. Um, the idea the farm having security and cameras and lights and all this other stuff, apparently there's a fence they had to dig under that was mentioned somewhere that all of that really illustrates another point that I like to talk about, which is there's a tremendous power in just showing up somewhere. Like I don't know if they'd done, I don't know if these activists had done surveillance on the farm before they showed up and actually carried out the action, but you could sit back and if I just told you, hey, this farm has cameras, they've got spotlights, they've got a fence that has to be dug under. There's a very good chance that a lot of people that might be on the fences, so to speak, as to whether or not they're going to carry out an action, might just go, yeah, we're not going to go to that farm. But there's a tremendous power in just showing up. In other words, you make an investment, a physical investment, a time investment to put yourself at a target, and it's amazing what you can do once you're actually there because you don't have the ability as easily to talk yourself out of it. And you tend to just find opportunities to get in or, ways to make things work that you might talk yourself out of if you're just sitting at home with like a blueprint of something, for example, or just imagine it in your head. So I do think there's a tremendous power, and if something seems intimidating, just simply go there, and it's amazing what obstacles you'll be able to overcome just by being physically at a place where you want something to happen.
Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you for, and by the way, Peter's book Liberate is available online. Highly recommend that book to everyone. I want to get into something else for a little bit, which is basically that we don't see as many fox liberations as mink liberations. Is that because there's less fox farms than mink farms, Dr. Vlasic, or why do you think that is?
Well, we really don't know how many fox farms there are in the country because it's they're not regulated in any way by the USDA like mink farms were, or at least until recently. So we don't know how many fox farms there are, although we're pretty sure there's a lot fewer fox farms than there are mink farms. There may be only 25 or so farms in the whole country in relation to fox farms, I'm saying, and there's probably only about from what I've been able to research, and again, we don't really have good numbers because nobody technically monitors this, but there may be only 15, I say only 1,500 or so captive fox that are killed and skinned for their fur every year. Still 1,500 too many. And this may have been one of the largest fox farms in the country with supposedly 100 foxes on it. I think the reason we see fewer of them, and by the way, we've seen 4 fox liberations in the last 2 years in the country. So it's not like they never happen, even though they are less common. But I think mainly it's because there are just fewer of them. I don't think they're necessarily any more difficult to access, or that there's any particulars about a fox farm versus a mink farm that make it any more difficult to raid. I think there's just fewer of them, and therefore they get raided less often.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think there's fewer of them. I think another element that's I think plays into this is I think activists raid mink farms because activists raid mink farms. And I think activists do what other activists do. So there was kind of this like snowball set in motion years ago where people just raided mink farms, and there have been fox farm liberations going back a lot of years. But I just think there's sort of a people do what other people do, and so because there's fewer fox farms, it leads to there's been fewer fox farm liberations. It leads to fewer fox farm liberations because it's just not in the forefront of activist minds as far as targets. I think that might be an element. In other words, if we start to see like the last few years, there have been quite a few, like we might see the stats flip where now everyone's raiding fox farms, which I think would be a fantastic. I think we can get into reasons why later why a fox farm is actually I think a better target than a mink farm. But I think that's a big part of it too. And also, yeah, the industry is not as documented. We know a lot more about where these mink farms are. Fox farms are most of the time they're hobbyist operations. They're just backyard operations. The Fur Commission USA, they represent mink farms. The fox farming industry has the Fox Shippers Council, and the Fox Shippers Council just doesn't talk as much. They don't. The Fur Commission kind of buries themselves because they just can't shut up, and so we just know a lot more than we should. But when it comes to fox farming, that whole industry is very insular, and they don't talk, they don't go to the media, they don't do anything, and so we know very little about, much less about that industry. So it's just, I think that's why we just know less, and that's why these actions happen less.
why wait? Let's get into it right now about why you think that fox farms might be a better target. I mean, just thinking off the top of my head, if what Dr. Vlasic is saying is correct, that there's maybe only about 1,500 captive foxes, this seems like an industry that could be taken out in the United States or North America, not to exaggerate, but maybe even overnight if there were a few ALF cells.
Yeah. So there's a few reasons. So there, one, yeah, like you said, it's much easier to empty a fox farm. The, we don't really know. I've seen fox. I've definitely been to fox farms that have foxes in the numbers like several hundreds, and but that's going to be about is big. I think the biggest fox farm, if that I'm aware of that I've ever heard of, it was an activist named Matt Roselle worked undercover there in the I think it's the mid 90s or so, and this is a farm in I think it was Roanoke, Illinois. And I think that farmer said he had 1,000 foxes. And we don't even know if that farm's still open. So there's a good chance it's not. But yeah, the average fox farm is going to be in the dozens. And so it's a more appetizing target for one because you can empty a farm much more easily and put the farmer out of business much more easily. It does not take it takes a very small amount of time to open a cage. Although I will say I'm getting off topic, but one reason fox farms are actually less appetizing than mink farms is the cages are often more difficult to open because unlike mink farms, where you can just usually just open a latch or lift a nesting box, with fox farms, in my experience, which is somewhat limited, the cages are usually much more difficult to open. They're wired shut. It can take several minutes to get inside, depending on how the farmer wants to do it. Um, but in any case, it's never going to be difficult. It's just going to be take a little more time. So you can empty a farm more easily. Number two, foxes are silent. The big reason that you hear about mink farms where there's, say a farm with 15,000 mink and only 2,000 get released, in my experience, I think I can't say obviously every instance, but I do think a big reason that people leave before they empty a farm is the noise. When you get even just a few hundred mink loose, they start screeching. They get very, very loud, and it's very intimidating because oftentimes you're within a close proximity of a farmer's house, and have a very reasonable concern about the farmer waking up from all the noise. The issue does not exist with foxes. They're silent, and so you can release 500 foxes and it'll be completely silent. You don't have to worry about the farmer waking up. That's a big one. And then the other one is that, well, I think those would be the big two.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. In communiques I've read, I think in the one from or the most recent mink raid, the communique was talking about how, as soon as they started opening the cages, like there was just like a wave of sound from the minks, being excited that they're about to be free. And with foxes, yeah, I didn't think about them being totally silent. Dr. Vlasak, can you talk a little bit about how uh, liberated foxes typically adapt, like once they're released into the wild? I know a lot of the talking points from the press office and elsewhere um, are largely related to mink, at least in my experience, like what I've read and what I've heard. So I'd love to learn a little more about foxes. And I know Peter said there's like a different organization that, what was the name of the organization with foxes, not for
The
commission,
Fox Shippers Council.
Fox Shippers Council. So I'm wondering if they put out like the same information as for Commission USA does, saying that, these animals will just be recaptured and there's no point in liberating them and that it's dangerous for them and, all those things.
Well, Trey, like mink, fox are native to North America, and so these animals have every expectation of being able to survive in the wild. Now, to their detriment, they're also some of them are more debilitated than their natural cousins would be because they've been kept in a tiny, small cage for their entire life. They're not out roaming, 5 or 10 miles a day and building up that kind of musculature and endurance. And so they may be at a slight disadvantage, but they are still genetically wild animals. And there have been studies, not nearly as many studies as there have been with mink, but there have been some studies regarding foxes that show that they do learn to hunt and they are capable of surviving in the wild. They're not going to all freeze to death or starve to death over the next few days. And unlike what the farmers say, they're not going to get run over by cars. As we all know, these places are remote and generally don't have a freeway running through the front yard. So there's every likelihood in the world that these foxes will survive if they are released into the wild. As far as the association that Peter spoke about, I don't know much about those guys. They don't seem to be nearly as aggressive as Fur Commission USA, which Fur Commission will often put out a press release when something like a liberation happens and try to counter all of our arguments in advance. And we really haven't seen much of that in the from the Fox organizations. I don't know. I don't have a lot of experience with these guys. Maybe Peter knows more about it.
No, they seem totally silent. They don't seem to have a press arm or anything. I've never heard any communications from them, public communications from the Fox Shippers Council. So
Peter, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about some of the, I guess, advantages or disadvantages of animal liberators going to a fox farm. I'm wondering, just because foxes are much bigger than minks, like what is a fox's general temperament? I mean, I know they're all individuals and they're different, but what what would an animal liberator maybe expect? Are foxes more dangerous because they're larger? Or is there any kind of extra precaution that these activists might have taken to liberate these foxes?
that's an interesting question. I never thought about it until right now. Like, is there any concern about foxes like attacking people? I never thought of that. I've only I pled guilty to releasing 100 foxes from a farm in Sioux City, Iowa. So that's my experience. And I've also been on many other fox farms, and they seem to be very fearful. So they tend to cower. Like they're not curious like mink. Like mink will come up to the cage and they try to figure out what's going on. Foxes seem to cower, and they're like I said, they're silent. And the one thing I think is notable is that, and the communique mentioned this, that when the cages were opened, that the foxes seem to not exit the cages immediately, and they seem to be timid. And that's my experience as well. And I mean, I've had conversations with other activists where, and I don't say this to be discouraging, but there's been some conversation about like, do these foxes even leave the cages? That's not discouraging because it can be very easy to coax them out. But and I do think I think the what makes them different than mink is that mink they'll just stage dive out of the cage and hit the ground running. Whereas again, with foxes, they seem to sit back, and I think they're concerned about the presence of humans. I think as long as a human is present, they're going to be much more likely to kind of not immediately leave the cage. And I mean, I remember at the farm I pled guilty to in Sioux City, Iowa, I remember we opened about 100 cages and we kind of circled back, and a lot of them were still in the cage. And then we retreated because there were mink and foxes. And then once we've been retreated for a while, we came back and we see foxes kind of prancing around the facility. So I do think it should not be discouraging for activists if they don't notice the foxes leave the cages right away, because I think they're just waiting for humans to leave. I also think to the extent that you have more time than you have cages to open, I think it would be wise to possibly consider coaxing the foxes out of the cage. There was one cage I remember where we didn't understand why the fox weren't leaving, so I kind of just like leaned the cage over on its side and tried to coax the fox out that way. And I think that would probably go a long way. But I do think activists can be confident the foxes will leave their cages once they're gone. I just think foxes have bad experiences with humans. For whatever reason, the relationship with humans is different than mink, and they're not likely to leave the cage when humans are around.
I
Someone
think just in general, I don't have a lot to add to that, but I think in general, foxes are just very, very shy animals. If you ever come across them in the wild, they're always very timid and very anxious to avoid all humans. And I think Peter's point is well taken, that I think once the humans are out of the picture, that they will definitely find themselves a way out.
Yeah, someone in the comments said, my friend works at a fox sanctuary and says that most of the foxes are very docile and harmless. I think that, along with what we read in the communique of, the foxes kind of being timid, and then, Peter's experience as well, just kind of drive home that point.
I don't think anybody that's planning to visit a fox farm needs to worry about the foxes being aggressive or trying to get after them or anything. That's just not in their nature in general.
Yeah. Um, I want to talk about something else that was in the communique, and I'd love for both of you to weigh in on this about the impact of taking the genetic information. In the communique, they mentioned that they took valuable genetic information about the foxes. Um, why is this strategically important, Dr. Vlasak, if you'd like to start?
Not my field of expertise, and Peter probably knows a lot more about it. But in general, these are pretty low budget operations. It's not like they have some sort of computer database that is constantly keeping track of which animal was bred with which. But they do have typically will have breeding pairs that are kept specifically for breeding characteristics that they have. And without knowing which foxes are which and which ones have been bred in which way, it makes it much more difficult for the fur profiteer to keep check on which animals have been bred with which animals and therefore which ones are producing the most quality fur. But maybe Peter can expand a little bit on that.
The first thing you always want to do when you're on a fur farm is identify where the breeders are. The breeders are the most valuable part of the stock, so to speak, and whether it's a mink farm or a fur farm. So the best thing you can always do is immediately, once you orient yourself, figure out where the breeders are, and because you usually have more cages to open than you have time. That's probably not going to be the case at a fox farm because, as we said, fox farms tend to be very small. But assuming you have more cages to open than you have time, you should always start with the breeders. And part of that is not just releasing the breeders, because what that does is it mixes them all together, and so the farmer can't tell which animal is which, and so the whole breeding stock is ruined. So that is extremely effective and strategic. But then what the communicator is referring to is these cards they put above every single cage that have the breeding information. This is what this mink or fox is. This is what this is, and at least going back a number of years, it was always highly strategic because this information was not backed up anywhere. And so the breeding stock was effectively ruined. Even if you didn't release the animals, it was still ruined because the cards were missing. I would have to assume now, I really don't know. I would have to assume that it's backed up now. But I mean, maybe not. And I bet a lot of these farmers don't even think of it. They don't even think they're going to be targeted. They're probably not even going to those lengths. So it's still valuable no matter what. But there was a period of time where nothing was backed up. I would have to assume at least the bigger operations are backing up their data now. But anyway, long story short, always target the breeders first thing.
The mixture of, I'm not sure how much a fox pelt sells for, but the mixture of liberating 25 foxes, assuming none of them are recaptured, and then destroying the genetic information, assuming that it's not backed up somewhere. Do we think that this action might be enough to put this farm close to like closing down or making it no longer viable? Or would there have to be a lot more that happens? What are we thinking on that? Either of you?
Jared, you want to go ahead?
I don't know. I mean, if assuming all 25 of them got away, and we don't know that, of course, and there's actually no mention in the communique about how many they thought got away, but I think even if 25 got away, it definitely made an impact on this guy, and he's definitely had a second raid almost 20 years ago now. There has to be some feeling, I think, on his part that he does have this paranoia that things are going to happen. And again, if he's not making a lot of money at this, Peter mentioned that a lot of these people are just hobbyists and kind of pick up a little extra spending money to get a new truck or something. But I got to think that at some point the paranoia, and certainly if he's having to spend more money on security measures, it could definitely become unprofitable for him very quickly. And so we don't know for sure that this farm is going to close. We can only wait to see. But many farms have closed after raids like this because again, it's a marginally profitable business to start with. And if you add in the cost of additional security measures, the fact that their insurance rates are almost certainly going to go up if they file any sort of a claim, these people are already on the verge of profitability, and many of them just decide not to go on. And of course, many of them are family businesses, and a lot of times the offspring of these horrible people decide to get out of that business and do something more ethical. And so there's not a lot of people clamoring to start or continue a fox farm. And we've seen, I mean, there's now probably, and we just got a recent figure from the Fur Commission USA that says they only know of 69 farms in the United States. And this is the industry itself talking. They not every farm necessarily is registered with the Fur Commission USA, and maybe Peter knows how many are or aren't, but I think the majority of them are. And so the industry themselves are saying we only got 69 places left in the whole country, and that's down from 400 or 500 maybe 10 years ago. So it's
Wow.
a huge decrease. The whole industry is on the ropes. I mean, they're this far, Trey, this far from being crushed. And if we can continue the pressure, both from illegal direct action, like what we've seen recently, and also targeting the demand side with efforts like Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade and AAC, if we can continue pressure on both ends, I think we've got a real good chance at beating the industry altogether.
The point, yeah, Jerry, the point you made about it, these being mostly hobbyist operations was exactly the point I was going to make, which is these farmers, these fox farmers in particular, unlike mink farmers, are much less financially invested in their own business. In fact, it oftentimes is not their main business. And you can just do the napkin math on, the average farm having 75 foxes and the pelts are, I'm rusty on my math here, but I think maybe $150 per pelt or something. So these people are not making a living off it. These are mostly, like I said, just people that for whatever reason have a sadistic hobby and are much less invested. And so I think the combination of the psychological stress of knowing, you're a target with the financial stress of having to like recoup losses of lost foxes, I just think it's too much for most of these farms to handle, particularly fox farms, much more so. I think they're much more vulnerable financially than mink farms.
Dr. Vlasak, you mentioned the fur industry being on the ropes, and we've talked about this before on live streams, I think, but um, I just wanted to bring it up again that, back in the 90s, everybody thought that fur was out. The movement stopped focusing on fur because they thought that it would sort of naturally flame out. But from the ashes, the fur industry rose again, and here we are kind of having to fight it all over again. I just wondered if you could talk for a moment about the importance of sort of like keeping the eye on the prize and keeping a focus on the fur industry and yeah, continuing on.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have been around back in the '90s and was working on the fur campaigns even back then, and there was a nationwide effort to try to focus on the fur industry. And again, people thought it was on the ropes, and they gradually, one by one, kind of moved on to other. A lot of them moved on to other things, and I think I think that was a mistake. I think the most strategic way to target animal exploitation is to find the weak links and target those guys because they're already on the ropes. And I think I would like to see that we continue this campaign now. They're more on the ropes now than they've ever been, including back in the '90s. And all it takes is one or two influencers to get their foot in the door and start promoting fur if we back off and are nowhere to be seen in response for the industry to become more profitable again. But right now, the price of fur pelts is very close to the break-even point. So nobody's making any money killing animals for their fur, or not much money anyway. And it's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about the money. And if people aren't making any money, then this whole industry will go away. So I think it's very important that we stay on top of this. I think now more than ever, we should be pushing even harder now that we've got them so close. And where we go, the rest of the world goes. So if you look at the numbers, the number of animals decreasing in the United States has a very close correlation to the number of animals being killed in places like China and Northern Europe. So we have a chance to lead the way. If we demolish the fur industry here in the United States, it will soon be followed by the demolition of the industry worldwide, and we have a chance to save hundreds of thousands of animals here. The number of animals, by the way, killed for fur in the United States is down from 5 million to well under a million. 761,000, I think, was the last stat I saw, and that's still way too many. But it's a small number compared to what it used to be. And I think we have a chance to completely annihilate the business if we can just not give up.
And I also want to just say on the ALF side of things, I think that that goal would probably be most efficiently achieved through direct action. When we had, especially now, when we got 70 mink farms left, under 70 mink farms left in the United States. And as far as fox farms, I think there's fewer than that. And anyone, we have not even talked about finalnail.com. Anyone can go to finalnail.com right now and get a list of all the known fox farms in the country and mink farms. And so we've got fewer than 70 mink farms, probably fewer than 50 mink farms. And what that means, and just if we just did the raw math, you could just have maybe just 4 cells teaming up, spending a few weeks targeting a few farms each, you could effectively ruin and destroy the mink farming and fox farming industry in this country. And that's very much within the reach of activists that exist right now that are probably watching this, that are on the fence as to whether or not they want to, carry out these actions and liberate animals directly. If they were to team up and go out and do that right now, do this right now, we're in a very good position to destroy the fur farming industry in this country in a very short amount of time. And again, I should have looked this up before we got on this call, but the number of fox farms left in the United States, I believe the number of known fox farms is in the dozens. So, and again, these are small operations, as Jerry highlighted, and so these are very, very easy targets.
Yeah. I just want to quickly reset for those who might be joining the live stream late. We are discussing a recent raid by the Animal Liberation Front of a fur farm in Illinois, where we think 25 foxes were released into the wild. That was the Litig Fur Farm in Illinois. And I'm joined here by Dr. Jerry Vlasak of the North American Animal Liberation Press Office and former animal liberator and political prisoner Peter Young. Peter, I want to go back to the communique for a second. They said that they promised they would be back to that same uh, fur farm, which is gutsy. It's gutsy to kind of like do something there and say you're going to return while their guard is up. So I'm wondering what's the likelihood of the ALF actually returning to this farm, as they say in the communique, because I think in your books that I've read that this has actually happened throughout history. People, hit the same farm within a short span of time.
Yeah, that line in the communique, it could just be rhetorical. It could just be something that was said. They may have every intention of coming back, and then maybe they won't go back. I think there actually has been very little historical precedent for activists returning to a farm in a very short time frame. Usually, when their activists return to a farm's been hit and it gets hit again, it's usually years have passed. There's only one example that I know of a farm being hit twice in quick succession. There was a farm in a town called Ellsworth, Iowa, right outside Jewell, Iowa, and it was I think the farm had about 2,000 mink, and it was raided, it was emptied, and the farmer was on news the next day bragging about, oh, we recaptured most of them. They didn't really have an impact. And so the activists showed up a few days later, re-released every animal, and the farm had to shut down. So, and I actually went back to the location of that farm to confirm it was closed, and it was just a cornfield. It was just literally gone. So that actually did happen one time. I hope it would happen again. I would hope that people would learn their history and know that it is possible. You can absolutely return. In fact, I wouldn't return the next night, but but I think the amount of security they're going to apply 5 days after a raid is going to be the exact same amount they're going to apply 5 years after a raid. So why not do it in 5 days?
Yeah,
And I think another important point is that now there's a lot of intelligence about this particular farm that's been stored by every member of that ALF cell, and so they all know where it is, what the best approaches are, what the fences look like, how easy it is to get in and out. And so there's a lot of intelligence that's been accumulated about this particular farm. So hopefully we'll get rated again. But like Peter said, we don't really have a lot of data that says these farms have been targeted again within a certain amount of time. We can only hope that with that data that's out there circulating among activists, and hopefully that we're circulating, that it'll encourage people to get out there and hit this place again. But again, there's 25 of them maybe around the country, and if 12 people get off their phones and computers and decide to go out and visit these things. In a night, you can make a difference to not only these individual animals, but a serious dent in the business altogether in the fur trade. And it doesn't take long. It doesn't mean mounting a 2-year campaign to close one fur store. It means taking 1 or 2 nights, doing some reconnaissance, and making a life and death difference for a number of animals, and putting a huge dent in the fur business.
Yeah, Peter mentioned learning about this history. I would highly recommend Peter's other book that he put together, The ALF Strikes Again, that just has, gosh, so many. It's right here on my bookshelf. It has so many communiques from all different kinds of actions. I would highly recommend reading that and checking it out. And yeah, like you said, Dr. Vlasic, maybe these particular activists will go back. Maybe somebody listening to this or somebody who's read the communique will be inspired to go back. Who knows what will happen? I wanted to get into a little bit more of the logistics side and return to that. Peter, I'm wondering what kind of habitats are best suited for released foxes. Um, is that something that people who liberate animals are thinking about, like where the fox farm is in relation to forest, or what are they thinking about there?
I think the environment you release the animals into is the environment surrounding the farm. I mean, the environment you release the animals into is the environment that you get when you show up. And so I don't think generally you're not going to have enough potential targets where you can, sit back and try to optimize for the environment around the farm. I think you just raid the farm that's in front of you, and the fate of those foxes is going to be better than the fate that's in store for them if they are left in those cages. So the only sort of consideration I might have if I was going to raid a fox farm, and this would actually be much more the case with mink farms, is you always want to strip away the maximum amount of fencing possible. The number of animals that actually get away and survive and reincorporate into the environment are always going to be it's going to be a direct correlation between the number of animals that survive and how much of the fencing you strip away. And so the more fencing you strip away, that's the single biggest variable that's going to impact how many other animals actually get away and survive. So unfortunately, a lot of times you don't have enough time to strip away the entire perimeter of a farm. So you have to choose which sections of the fence to dismantle. And so if you're in that situation where you don't have enough time to cut up away the entire fencing, you probably want to choose the fencing that faces away from the road. Um, but again, oftentimes you don't even have that option because maybe that's the side where the farmer's house is and you have to operate on the other side. And so you just have to work with the conditions that you're given when you show up at a farm. The most important thing is you do something. So I don't think anyone should be dissuaded from carrying out a fox or mink farm liberation if simply because it's near a road or because maybe the environment's a little bit sparse. Maybe it's a cornfield. Well, there's stuff beyond the cornfield. The foxes will find it. And I just think the most important thing is you just release the animals.
I think it's important to remember too that foxes are very adaptable animals, and they've learned to live in fairly urban areas sometimes. So just because the farm's not next to an endless forest or something is not a good reason not to release them. They can do very well in a wide variety of both urban and rural environments. And I think the other thing that's important to remember is that there's a 100% mortality rate if they're not released, and so giving them a chance at freedom is better than nothing. And sometimes not all of them will survive if they're released, but many of them will. And 100% of them are going to be annually electrocuted or gassed or clubbed come around November when the farmer decides to kill them and take their skin.
One point, if I could, going back to the last question about what is the likelihood of the activist showing back up shortly after the last raid. The riskiest part is going to be once you cross the threshold. When you're on the safe side of the fence, in other words, you're off the property and you haven't actually crossed that threshold yet, there's very little risk. You're not exposed to really much risk at all at that point. The risk comes when you cross the threshold when you potentially, there's cameras. Apparently at this facility there were lights and cameras. That's where the risk comes in. And then particularly when you start releasing the animals, at least with mink, it gets very loud, right? So that's kind of where the risk comes in. So with the fox farm, it's particularly with how small these farms are, it's very reasonable to just carry out a hit and run action where once you're on the safe side of the fence, you can fell the fence, cut it, dismantle it, cut holes in it, whatever you want to do. Not a lot of risk at that stage. And then if you've got on the other side of that 50 foxes and you're there with two or three people, you could potentially be in and out of there in the amount of time it would take for the farmer to put his slippers on. And so there is also this type of action where you're just doing a hit and run, like it's a kamikaze mission. Like you're exposing yourself to a tremendous amount of risk, but you also know you're gonna be able to get away faster than anyone could respond. It's kind of like the successful bank robbers. They have like the 2 minute timer. They're out in 2 minutes. They know nothing's gonna happen in 2 minutes. Same formula could apply to a fur farm where you're just in and out in 5 minutes, and the risk is essentially non-existent.
Yeah, and unlike a bank robber, they are saving lives instead of just, taking money. That's something else you talked about in your book about how creative people got and how much people were willing to risk for personal gain, like something like a bank robbery. And, you know, um, here's all these lives that could be saved with much less risk than a bank robbery. And this year we're starting to see some more of these liberations. There's been, I know, at least a couple of mink liberations, and now this fox liberation with some maybe a promise to return. We'll see what happens. Um, I wanted to ask a question about the cultural shift for fur. We've seen Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade and grassroots groups going after all these big name designers and brands in the last 5-ish years. I think there's been about like 40 fur-free policies that cover over 100 brands. Big recognizable names like Marc Jacobs, Saks Fifth Avenue, YSL, Dolce& and Gabbana, Canada Goose, Montclair, and Max Mara. That's just off the top of my head. There's so many. Um, so somebody might look at that and say, like, well, it's not really important to rate a fox farm or rate a mink farm because, the cultural mindset is going away from fur and all these campaigns are being won. I'd like to hear from both of you on why you think that illegal direct action is still vitally important. Dr. Vlask, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think it's important that we continue to hit both sides, both the supply and the demand sides of the fur industry, because you're right, it's kind of out from a fashion standpoint right now. But all it takes is one Kardashian or one Beyonce or somebody to show up wearing fur, and you can get a whole new group of people that never get off their phone that see that sort of thing and start thinking it's a trend again. And so it's a very fickle industry, and we've seen that before. We've seen it go out of fashion and nobody wants to wear it. And it doesn't take much to get back into the mainstream. So I think we have to hit both sides of it. So if by hitting the supply side, it makes it more expensive and more rare to find the stuff, and by hitting the demand side, we keep it out of fashion, and so there's less demand and keeps the prices low, and the farmers can't make any money at it. So why continue to go into business?
Yeah, I agree. And it's a curious discussion because it sort of implies that people have to choose. Like as a movement, we have to choose which direction we go, and also suggests that individuals have to choose one or the other. And it's a false binary. I mean, you can be protesting, a fur store in the day, and you can go out at night and raid a fur farm. And there's no reason you can't do both. And the same thing as a movement. Like it's going to take both, and it should take both. I think, the direct action approach is going to be the most efficient route for sure. At this point, particularly, we talked earlier about how it would just take a small number of people to really wipe out, particularly, well, I mean, mink farming and fox farming, but again, as we talked about, fox farming is particularly vulnerable. And, but yeah, I mean, we can and should be doing both.
Yeah, Peter, can you talk more too about just like you were talking about individuals as activists, what about the individuals that are the animals? I mean, you've been on these fur farms, pled guilty, and served prison time for liberating these animals. Was that worth it to you? What's it like um, seeing these individuals who are getting their freedom because of action that you decided to take? If someone had not intervened, they would have met certain death, but because someone stepped up and took a risk, they were able to live.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few times in life where there's just a perfect alignment, between your thoughts and your actions and your purpose. And so I think any activist that is carried out an action like this will find that what was a moment of true alignment where they were living consistently with their beliefs and also saving lives and doing it in a way that was just without permission. And I think so much as activists, so much of what we do is we're essentially just groveling. We're like panhandlers, like please politician do this, please company do this. And there's another approach where you don't have to have permission. You can just bring freedom to these animals without anyone's permission. And so that's what's so beautiful about the ALF and direct action. And yeah, I mean, going back to that, I mean that it was definitely a top five like deathbed, highlight reel moment when the Fox Farm it was a mink and fox farm in Sioux City, Iowa that I referenced earlier that I pled guilty to, but it backed up to a state park, and so we released 5,000 mink and 100 foxes. And as we're leaving, it's up on a hill, and it just slopes down into this um, grassland. It was like this. It wasn't even farm. It was like actual. It was a state park, so it was just like grass, and it was just like you could just see the grass just moving with mink, thousands. And there's a sun and the moonlight and the whole thing. And so yeah, I mean, if I think that you know anyone that's frustrated as an activist, sh don't burn out. Uh, Go carry out ALF actions, and you will find yourself reinvigorated.
Yeah. Um, we have a question in the comments for you, Peter. Um, Rachel asks, um, the cages are all the foxes have ever known. I wonder if rescue missions will ever include transporting foxes to a sanctuary to rehabilitate first, then reintroduce them to the wild. I know that there have been some efforts for this kind of thing where like a fur farm's closing down or something, and the animals are like rescued and taken to a sanctuary instead of released into the wild. I know if you're doing this like below ground, that would probably make the action much harder. You'd have to like secure homes and do all this stuff. But I'm curious to know your opinion for Rachel's question.
Sure. Definitely an ideal scenario is every fox gets liberated, gets removed from a fox farm, taken to a sanctuary, rehabilitated. 100% that would be the ideal. The reason that is almost always difficult to impossible is that one, it involves bringing more people into an action that have the potential to. I mean, the risk that you incur is one of the major variables is how many people are involved, right? So if you've got a sanctuary owner, they're legally implicated at the point they take quote stolen property, and that's one more person you have to trust, and the likelihood of you having a very solid, trustworthy relationship with a sanctuary owner maybe isn't that high, and so you're kind of just blindly hoping these people don't have loose lips. So there's that whole element of risk that gets introduced. Also, logistically, it's probably going to be almost impossible unless you're involving multiple U-Haul trucks to physically remove every fox from a farm and take it elsewhere. Um, Another option would be maybe releasing fewer, not releasing the animals, taking fewer animals than you could have released and release them off site somewhere. I think I think that comes down to just a math equation. If you've got 100 foxes on a farm, you can open all 100 cages, and you have a reasonable expectation the majority of those foxes are going to find their way off the farm before the farmer finds out. You have to compare that and weigh that against how many foxes can we physically transport off-site. And that's going to be a very small number most of the time. Most of the time, if you're carrying out an action, you're not going to be able to assemble a team of, 5, 6, 7 people. At best case scenario, you're lucky if you can find 3 other people to work with. Usually it's just going to be 1 or 2 other people. So having to physically transport animals to a vehicle that you probably have to rent to be able to hold, it just gets logistically very, very challenging. So I think when you consider I can release 100 foxes, have a reasonable expectation most of them will get away versus I can maybe physically transport 5, people are going to opt for releasing the 100 foxes and just hoping for the best.
And I think you have to weigh the impact on the profiteer as well, because taking 5 of his 100 foxes, even though they would have a better chance of survival in the wild after being rehabilitated, they're not going to have nearly the economic impact on the fur farmer than if all 100 animals got released. And even if there was a higher mortality in the wild, it would. I think you have to weigh that against the impact it would have on the farmer. And like Peter said, it's logistically virtually impossible to go somewhere in the middle of the night and load up 100 foxes or even 20 foxes into a cargo van, still in their cages, and not exponentially increase the chance of getting caught. And while we're talking about the chances of getting caught, I just want to say to those out there that may be considering a career in underground direct action, your chances of getting caught are very, very small. There have been dozens and dozens of these types of liberations. There's been at least a dozen in the last 3 or 4 years alone. Almost no one ever gets caught, and almost even of the people that get caught, even fewer spend very long in jail. So it's not a very typically not a very hazardous profession to get into. It can be a very safe thing to do if you just take a little care and caution and apply some basic rules, many of which are outlined in some of the books that Peter's released.
We have another question from in the comments from Lewis or Luis, I'm not sure. How effective and important are civil disobedience actions coupled with education of the public as done during Free Friday actions of the 1990s to impact the consumer demand of fur? I have a feeling I know what you guys are going to say about this, but Peter, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, I mean, everyone just can pick a lane and do what they think is most effective. I certainly celebrate those actions as much as anything else. I mean, my feeling is even if my opinion is that the animals would be best served if everyone just went to a fur farm and liberated every animal. I do know that, and I've come to accept this over time. I used to think everyone just needs to like get over their fear. I understand a lot of people are just not wired for it. They're just never going to be that personality type where that makes sense for them or where they feel like it's even realistic for them to ever carry out an action like that. I do think everyone should push their comfort zone and really confront, ask themselves before they resign themselves to only doing civil disobedience. They should ask themselves, well, is this a decision I'm making because I just really truly I'm not built for it, or is it just because it's a safer route? But assuming you're just never ever going to carry out direct action, and or even if you are, civil disobedience actions are fantastic. I do think the question referenced the 90s, and I do think you have a significant difference now in the 90s versus today, which is that you could do almost anything to get on the front page of a newspaper and be top of mind for everybody in a major city. It was very, very easy to capture media attention, and you had all the eyeballs and everyone's attention funneled to just 1 or 2 or 3 media outlets in every major city. Now everyone's attention is so divided. So a civil disobedience action that gets media attention, you're not really penetrating the minds of as many people as you would have been back in the 90s. So I do think it has a diminished impact, but still important.
Would you like to add anything, Dr. Vlasic?
Yeah, I'll add something. I think, like Peter said, there was a time in the 90s where civil disobedience had a role, it would get us on the front page of the paper, or at least get a good mention in the paper. Today, that almost never happens. In my opinion, civil disobedience has absolutely no role in the struggle against the fur industry. It incurs legal costs. It takes people out of the movement because they have to they get on probation and things like that. And I don't think educating the public is an important part of this part of the struggle right now. 99% of the people in the United States are against wearing fur. They think fur is stupid. They know it's cruel. They don't want anything to do with it. And the remaining 1 or 2% of people that are promoting fur and that still wear fur are people you're not going to change your mind by doing outreach, whether that's just outreach on the street at a march for the animals, or whether that's doing civil disobedience and trying to get your message into the media. So, in my opinion, you're wasting your time doing outreach and civil disobedience in the fur industry. And I would say I agree with Peter that not everybody's cut out to do illegal direct action. I understand that, and not everybody's going to. But if you don't find yourself in the position of being able to do illegal direct action, do something else that's effective, and that's not outreach. That is getting involved in focus campaigning, like what Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade is doing and what AAC is working on. Get out there and put your efforts into a very focused campaign, not only focused on the fur industry, but focused on particular targets at this time in the fur industry until they're encouraged to move into a more humane field and then go after the next target. And that's called focus campaigning or targeted campaigning. It's the sine qua non of Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade. That's abolishfur.com on the web, or at Animal Activism Collective. So if you're not cut out for doing illegal direct action, get involved with a focus campaign like one of those. Don't waste your time doing civil disobedience or trying to outreach to the general public.
We have another question. Uh, Are cages individually locked and need to be cut open, or are the cages able to be unlocked by hand? You were talking a little bit about this earlier, Peter, but maybe you could talk specifically about again about the difference between like a mink cage, a fox cage, and anything
Yeah,
else.
that's a major distinction I've seen between mink farms and fur farms, which is that mink cages are almost never. In fact, I've only seen it a couple times where mink cages are individually wired shut. You usually only see that with the breeders, whereas with fox farms, that's in fox cages, that's usually always the case. I shouldn't say usually always the case. That is very often the case, where the cages are either they'll have a padlock on them, they'll be wired shut with little O-rings, or something else that makes it there's a little more challenge to opening the cage beyond just opening a latch. So for that reason, a fox farm liberation is expected to take longer because you have to kind of orient yourself to what is the locking mechanism, what prevents this cage from opening. I've seen cages that were seriously wired shut, where it would have taken, a significant amount of wire cutter surgery to open the cages, which is again, it's never that challenging, so it shouldn't dissuade anyone. But in my experience, to answer the question briefly, the fox cages are most often individually locked or wired shut.
All right. Just a couple more questions before we wrap up. If you are listening to this live, we have time for maybe one or two more questions in the comments, but in the time being, I want to ask what you all, and we'll start with Dr. Vlasak, what you think this action says about the future of the ALF. Are we seeing more of a trend in these illegal direct actions? Are we seeing more of that? Do you think it'll continue? Do we think it'll continue with fox farms, especially with the thought that maybe the fox farming industry could be taken out sooner, or any other thoughts you might have, Dr. Vlasic?
I'm going to be optimistic and say I think that the Animal Liberation Front and illegal direct action in particular is on the upswing again. It was much more active in the 90s than it was. Then there was a kind of a lag as people got used to their social media and being online all the time. And I think maybe now there's a new age of people deciding, you know what, I want to be I want to really make a difference, and I can make a difference by getting out there and actually doing something. So I'm gonna say I hope so. Differentiating between fox farms and mink farms, for instance, I don't think that's all that important. I think there's roughly less than 100 farms altogether probably out there, and there's an exact listing of where every single one is on finalnail.com. I don't think there's any reason why people shouldn't be out there every single weekend. And between now and November is the best time to go because the animals are mature enough to survive more likely to survive in the wild. And they're all going to be killed. 100% of them are, except maybe the breeders, are going to be murdered in November. So anybody that's not busy between now and the end of November, I think, should be out there finding where the nearest fox farm is and or the nearest mink farm and going there and doing that. And I think we could beat the industry in a year if everybody would get off their phone and do that. So
I agree. I think it's trend. Yeah, I think I think one of the reasons we're going to see it trending in a positive direction is that the industry is so close to collapse. And even though it's always about the individual animals, I think when you combine the obvious benefit to individual animals with the potential that releasing those animals could also accelerate the decline of an industry in a real meaningful way, I think that's all the motivation anyone should need to take action. I think the number that Jerry brought up, which I actually was not aware of, I think is fascinating, is that there's only 1,500 foxes in prison, possibly by some estimates, on farms in this country, which means if you release 150 fox, that's 10% of the entire, and it's still 150 fox, 150 fox, and that's all that matters. But at the same time, that added kind of no knowledge of like, I really put a measurable dent in this entire industry, is a real perfect storm for these actions continuing to increase.
Yeah. Uh, Someone in the comments, one is asking or saying, please clarify the position that outreach is not effective. Is that specific to outreach against fur or in general? I think a lot of people watching know that Animal Activism Collective supports all different kinds of activism, and we um, support people on their journeys and in order to do that and have a variety of different ways that people can get involved. But would love to hear your response, Dr. Vlasak. Peter, I know you've like written a little bit about this topic.
I think outreach can be important in certain areas. Absolutely. I think um, talking about the meat and dairy industry in particular, I think outreaching to people who don't know anything about veganism, have never considered veganism, can change minds and therefore save lives. I don't think in the anti-fur struggle that outreach has a large role to play at all. I think most, like I said before, most people know how cruel fur is, and some people just don't care. And if they don't care, they're not going to start caring just because you hand them a flyer or talk to them about what they're doing. So, just to clarify, I don't think outreach is an effective tactic um, in um, in the struggle against fur. I think if you can't do illegal direct action, which by far and away is the most effective way to end the fur trade. I think if you can't do that, that you should get involved in these targeted campaignings, which embarrass and annoy and irritate companies that are still profiting from the fur industry. And again, those protests and those disruptions and those all the other things that these groups do when they're focused campaigning against a particular target, it's not really meant to educate the public. You're not holding a sign on the sidewalk because you want to convince people walking by to stop wearing fur. You're doing that to annoy the people and to discourage the people that are profiting from the fur industry to stop doing that. And those are the two most effective ways to fight the fur industry. And that's kind of what we're here to discuss today. I don't think I'm not saying all outreach in every aspect of the struggle for animal liberation is a bad idea, just in the fur industry.
Anything to add to that, Peter, or should I just go on with the last question?
No, Jerry nailed it.
Cool. All right, last question. Thank you guys so much for joining. I want to leave you with this one, which is to ask, what do you think about the communique's call to action? Which I'll quote it: "To all the vegans reading this, it's your turn now." What do you have to say? Final thoughts of the live stream, Dr. Vlask, if you'd start us off.
I love that, and I think it's important for there to build an enthusiasm for this kind of action that we haven't seen in quite a while, on a more widespread basis. And I think about you know people that have been active for years like I have, or even people that are new to the industry, you might occasionally ask yourself the question, or you should ask yourself the question, is what I'm doing important, and can my actions really make a difference? And I can assure you, those that heed the call of direct action never question their impact. They know they've been effective. They've been effective for the particular animals that they've helped save, or if they've just committed acts of economic sabotage, which is another form of illegal direct action that we didn't talk about a lot today, but infacting the profits, even when it doesn't involve actually liberating animals by destroying property or breaking windows or doing whatever it is that makes it more expensive to be a fur profiteer. Nobody that does that sort of stuff has to question themselves and say, am I doing something that's effective? It is the most effective way to help animals, period.
Yeah, well put. And I think putting a line like that in a communique, I mean, you've already taken something that is the most effective action you can take for an animal, which is to directly save its life. And then you've got these activists sitting back saying, okay, how can we make this even better? How could we expand the impact of this action even more? And that would be if every single person that read the communique, or even 1%, or even 1% of people that read the communique also had that moment of like, you know what? I'm going to go out and do this too. And so then it would have an exponential impact. And so I think, you've got the people who wrote this communique, and they're saying, how can we have an even bigger impact on animals? And it would be if everyone, instead of cheering them on, actually participated in ALF actions. Instead of sitting back and saying, hey, I support what you did, good job, actually converted that support into becoming one of them, into becoming the ALF. And I think that is what the intention of those activists was. And I do hope there's people out there that take that message to heart.
Yeah, Trey, people contact the press office all the time and say, how do I join the ALF? Where do I find these people? How do I connect with them? How do I join? You don't join the ALF, you become the ALF. And anybody that's vegan and goes out there and either inflicts economic sabotage against those who profit from animal abuse, or who liberates animals from conditions of abuse, has the opportunity to call themselves the Animal Liberation Front, or any other group they want to call themselves a member of. There's other underground groups, but the ALF is the most common. So there's no membership card, there's no headquarters down in Washington or anything like that. You are the ALF. You can get together with one or two of your friends, or just do it by yourself. I mean, a lot of people do it by themselves. And you can study up some resources. You can look on our website at animalliberationpressoffice.org. We have a lot of links on resources on how to be smart about this kind of thing, and get out there and do it. But anybody can do it. Anybody can become the Animal Liberation Front.
All
And
right. Go
one
ahead.
more thing I just want
Yeah.
to add. The biggest obstacle to becoming the ALF is always going to be finding people to work with. And so, to Jerry's point, you can absolutely work by yourself. In fact, there is no target anywhere that is better suited for a single person action than a fox farm, because they're so small for all the reasons we talked about. So, um, if you're sitting back and you're like, wow, I would love to carry an action like this, but I don't know anyone else to work with, you don't need to know anyone else. You can act alone. And I want a final shout out to finalnail.com. If people are wondering what's the missing piece here, how do I actually find out where these farms are, finalnail.com is the place to go.
Thank you so much to my guests, Dr. Jerry Vlasak of the Animal Liberation Press Office, and Peter Young. You can check out the North American Animal Liberation Press Office online on their website, on Instagram, and you can order Peter Young's books online, Liberate, the ALF Strikes Again, and others. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time to join the live stream today. And thank you, Dr. Vlasic and Peter.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Trey. Thanks for putting this together.